Chicago, summer of 1949. The Civic Opera House was packed with 3,500 people standing on their feet, applauding. Louis Armstrong lifted his trumpet to his lips, ready to play the opening notes of West End blues. When something happened, a voice rose from deep within the crowd, adding a perfect harmony to Louis's melody. So pure, so crystal clear, that Louis pulled the trumpet away from his lips and froze. At 69 years old, with 40 years of stage experience and thousands of concerts behind him, the legend stood as shocked as the day he first stepped on stage. That voice was the most perfect harmony Louis had ever heard in his life, but its owner remained hidden in the darkness. The crowd waited in silence. Who was this mysterious voice? And why couldn't Louis hold back his tears? But what happened that night can only be understood by going back 3 weeks earlier, because the story that unfolded on that Chicago stage had actually begun in the lonely hotel rooms where Louis tried to find peace, in his exhausted body and in a memory he had carried for decades. If this story has grabbed your attention, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because what I'm about to share reveals one of the most mysterious and emotional moments in jazz history. 3 weeks before that magical night, Louis Armstrong was sitting alone in his Detroit hotel room. It was late August, and the summer heat was suffocating. Louis had just finished a grueling 2-hour performance at the Fox Theater, and every bone in his body ached. At 48 years old, he was no longer the young man who could play for hours without rest. His lips were cracked and bleeding from the trumpet's mouthpiece. His lungs burned with every breath, but Louis never complained. Louis Armstrong was a man who had climbed from the muddy streets of New Orleans, survived reform school, faced racism at every turn, and still managed to smile through it all. He was known as Satchmo, the grinning genius who brought joy to millions. But that night in Detroit, sitting alone with his trumpet resting on the bed beside him, Louis felt a deep, soul-level weariness that made him wonder how much longer he could keep going. His manager, Joe Glazer, had booked him solid through the fall. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, city after city, performance after performance. Louis never said no. He couldn't. Because for every show he played, there were thousands of people who had saved their money and came to hear him. How could he disappoint them? So he pushed through the pain, plastered on his famous smile, and gave them the show they deserved. But lately Louis had started hearing echoes of the past. Sometimes during performances, he thought he heard his mother's voice singing the old spiritual she used to hum when he was a child in New Orleans. Other times he heard Peter Davis, the music teacher at the colored waifs' home who had first put a cornet in his hands, back in 1912. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. Louis's doctor had warned him just a month earlier that his blood pressure was dangerously high, that he needed to slow down, but how could he? There were contracts to fulfill, audiences to please, a legacy to maintain. The Chicago booking had come through Joe Glazer's office in mid-August. The Civic Opera House had requested Louis for a special late summer concert. Louis had agreed immediately. Chicago held special meaning for him. It was in Chicago back in 1922 that he had joined King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band and truly launched his career. But as the date approached, Louis felt an unusual nervousness building inside him. He couldn't explain it. He had performed thousands of concerts, yet something about this show filled him with inexplicable anticipation mixed with dread. 2 days before the Chicago concert, Louis had a strange dream. He was back in New Orleans, standing on Perdido Street, where he used to sing for pennies as a child, but everything was silent. Then, from somewhere in the distance, he heard a woman singing. The voice was hauntingly beautiful, singing one of his mother's old spirituals in a style that blended classical training with deep soul. Louis tried to run toward the voice, but his legs wouldn't move. The voice grew louder, closer, and then Louis woke up in his Boston hotel room, his heart pounding. What did it mean? Was it a premonition? The morning of the Chicago concert, September 15, 1949, dawned hot and humid. Louis arrived at the Civic Opera House early for sound check. The venue was magnificent, red velvet seats, ornate golden fixtures, a massive stage with perfect acoustics. Everything was perfect Yet Louis couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. As the audience began filing in that evening, Louis stood backstage in his white tuxedo, his trademark handkerchief folded perfectly in his pocket, his trumpet in hand. He could hear the crowd's excited murmur growing louder. 3,500 people, all here to see him. He whispered a quick prayer, something he did before every show, asking for strength to give these people the performance they deserved. The crowd erupted as Louis walked onto the stage. The spotlight hit him, and he raised his trumpet in greeting, flashing that famous Satchmo smile. The applause was deafening. He launched into "That's All Right" to warm up the crowd, his trumpet singing with that distinctive gravelly sweetness that only Louis Armstrong could produce. By the third song, they were on their feet. Louis felt the familiar rush of performance energy flooding through him, temporarily erasing the exhaustion and pain. Then came West End Blues, Louis's masterpiece, the song that had revolutionized jazz back in 1928. This was the moment the audience had been waiting for. The house lights dimmed, creating an intimate atmosphere. Louis raised his trumpet to his lips and prepared to play that iconic opening phrase. But before he could, something extraordinary happened. From somewhere deep in the audience, the middle section, maybe row 15 or 20, a woman's voice rose into the silence, not shouting, not disrupting, but singing. She was adding a harmony to the melody that hadn't even been played yet. It was as if she knew exactly what Louis was about to play and was complementing it with a soprano line of breathtaking beauty. Louis froze. The trumpet remained at his lips, but no sound came out. He was too shocked to play. The voice continued, weaving a melodic line that was simultaneously classical in technique and jazz in feeling. Every note was perfect. Every phrase was musical. This wasn't some enthusiastic amateur. This was a trained vocalist of exceptional skill. The backing musicians exchanged confused glances. The audience sat in stunned silence. The mysterious voice sang through the entire opening phrase of West End Blues, then fell silent, as if waiting for Louis to respond. Louis slowly lowered his trumpet. His hands were trembling. He squinted into the audience, trying to locate the source of that magnificent voice. The spotlight operator began sweeping the light across the middle section where the voice had originated. But there were hundreds of people sitting there. "Who are you?" Louis called out, his voice filled with awe. "Please, whoever you are, I need to see you." The audience held its breath. No one answered. No one stood up. Have you ever experienced a moment so unexpected that it changed everything? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Louis tried again. "Ma'am, that was the most beautiful thing I've heard in 40 years of making music. Please, come on up here." Still nothing, just silence. Louis turned back to the audience. "All right, mystery lady. You don't want to come up here, I respect that. But would you do me the honor of singing with me one more time? I promise I'll play this time." Then, after what felt like an eternity, the voice returned. This time, she sang the opening line of "What a Wonderful World." Her interpretation was stunning. She took the simple lyrics and elevated them to something transcendent. And this time, Louis was ready. He lifted his trumpet and joined her, his horn providing a counter melody to her vocals. The two sounds wove together in perfect harmony. It was as if they had rehearsed for years, as if they knew each other's musical instincts intimately. For 3 minutes, Louis Armstrong and an unknown woman created something that had never existed before. When the song ended, the entire Civic Opera House erupted. People were crying. Musicians stood in the wings with their mouths open. But Louis had stopped playing. He was crying. Tears streamed down his face as he stood center stage. The audience quieted down, concerned. Louis wiped his eyes with his white handkerchief and spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry, folks. I'm not usually one to cry in public, but that voice reminds me of someone I lost a long time ago. Someone who taught me that music isn't just about the notes you play. It's about the soul you pour into them." What Louis didn't tell the audience was this. That voice belonged to someone he had been searching for without realizing it. For 20 years, since his mother Mary Ann had passed in 1927, Louis had carried a specific regret. He had never recorded music with her. His mother had sung in church choirs, had hummed spirituals while doing laundry, had filled their tiny New Orleans home with melody despite crushing poverty. And now, hearing this unknown woman's voice, Louis was transported back to those childhood moments when his mother's singing made everything bearable. But who was this woman? If you're finding this story as moving as I am, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like this need to be shared and remembered. What happened next would answer some questions but create even more mystery. A commotion began in the middle section. People were standing, turning, pointing. Someone was moving through the row. The spotlight swung over and the audience got their first glimpse of the mystery singer. She was a woman in her early 40s with striking features, pale skin, jet black hair cut in a sharp bob that framed her face, and a jawline so defined it could have been carved by a sculptor. She wore a simple navy blue dress, but even from the stage, Louis could see that she was beautiful in that timeless, understated way. She moved slowly up the aisle, and as she got closer, Louis could see her eyes were red from crying. She stopped at the foot of the stage. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Louis knelt down, bringing himself closer to her level. "Who are you, ma'am?" The woman's voice was barely audible. "My name is Catherine Moreau." Louis nodded encouragingly. "Can you tell me why you were singing? And how do you know my music so well?" Catherine's face crumpled. "Because your music saved my life, Mr. Armstrong. When I lost my parents in a car accident when I was 18, your recordings were the only thing that kept me going. When my husband died of cancer 5 years ago, I listened to What a Wonderful World every night because it reminded me that somewhere, beauty still existed in this broken world." The audience was crying now. Louis reached down and took Catherine's hand. "Come up here, please." Catherine shook her head. "I can't. I didn't mean to disrupt your concert." Louis squeezed her hand. "You didn't disrupt anything. You made this the most important performance of my career. Now please come up here and sing with me properly." Hesitantly, Catherine climbed the steps to the stage. In the spotlight, you could see the weight she carried in the slight stoop of her shoulders, in the way her hands trembled. Louis guided her to center stage and did something that shocked everyone. He didn't play his trumpet. Instead, Louis Armstrong sang a duet with Catherine Moreau. Their voices blended in a way that defied explanation. His gravelly baritone and her pure soprano created something that transcended technical perfection and touched something deeper, the shared experience of loss, of perseverance, of finding beauty in suffering. Louis invited Catherine to stay on stage for the rest of the concert. Together they performed Summertime, and finally, When the Saints Go Marching In. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. When the final notes faded, Louis took Catherine's hand and they bowed together to a standing ovation that lasted 11 minutes. After the show, backstage, Louis invited Catherine to his dressing room. For an hour, they talked. She told him about her life, losing her parents, meeting her husband David, who had been a teacher, his cancer, his death, that left her completely alone. Louis listened with attention. He rarely gave anyone because he recognized in Catherine's story elements of his own journey. Different details, but the same truth. Life could be cruel, but music offered a way to bear it. Before Catherine left that night, Louis did something unprecedented. He wrote down his personal phone number. "You call me if you ever need anything. And I mean anything. You need someone to talk to. You need help. You call me." Catherine clutched the paper like it was the most valuable thing she'd ever been given. "Mr. Armstrong, Louis," he interrupted. "You call me Louis. After tonight, we're friends." Catherine hugged him, a long, tight embrace that communicated everything words couldn't. The story of that night spread quickly through the jazz community. Catherine declined all interviews. She wasn't interested in fame. Louis respected her privacy. "Some things are meant to stay pure," he told journalists. "What happened that night was between me, Catherine, and the 3,500 souls who were there to witness it." But Louis kept in touch with Catherine. They spoke on the phone every few weeks. Louis became a father figure to her, offering wisdom and comfort. And in 1955, when Catherine finally felt ready to perform publicly again, Louis arranged for her to sing at a benefit concert for music education. She performed beautifully, and while she never pursued a professional career, she began teaching voice lessons to young students from difficult backgrounds, telling each of them how Louis Armstrong's music had saved her life. Louis Armstrong continued performing until his death in 1971. But he often said that the September night in Chicago when Catherine Moreau sang from the audience was the single most important performance of his entire career. Not because of the music itself, although that had been extraordinary, but because it reminded him and everyone there of music's true purpose, to connect human beings across all the barriers that separate us. 15 years after Louis's death, in 1986, Catherine Moreau was teaching at a community music school in Milwaukee. One of her students, a shy 14-year-old girl named Maria, who had lost her mother to illness, was struggling with a song. Catherine sat beside her at the piano and began to sing, showing her how to find the emotion beneath the notes. As Catherine sang, Maria suddenly stopped playing and stared at her teacher with wide eyes. "Miss Moreau," the girl whispered, "when you sing, I feel like my mom is in the room with me again." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. She took Maria's hand and said, "That's exactly what music is for, sweetheart. It's a bridge between the living and those we've lost, between pain and healing, between loneliness and connection." Maria nodded, not fully understanding but sensing the profound truth in her teacher's words. And as they returned to the song, Catherine thought of Louis Armstrong, that September night in Chicago when her voice had risen from the darkness and changed both their lives forever, because that's what Louis and Catherine had discovered together on that stage. The most powerful moments in life aren't planned or rehearsed. They emerge from the shadows when broken hearts find the courage to sing, when strangers become witnesses to transformation, when music stops being performance and becomes salvation. That night at the Civic Opera House, 3,500 people learned that we're never too lost, never too broken, never too alone to find our voice. And somewhere in the universe, perhaps Louis Armstrong's trumpet and Catherine Moreau's voice still harmonize in that perfect, impossible way, reminding us that even in our darkest moments, there's always someone listening, always someone who understands, always a song waiting to be sung. All we have to do is open our mouths and let the music carry us home.